We are caught in the nets of wrong and right. We are caught in the nest of outward order. Our hearts are worn out, if not dead, and so we do not see the fairies, said young Willie Yeats in 1901. And so he condescended to roam the wild countryside, collecting tales of the Celtic fairyland before it died. And he found that Canada, Australia, New Zealand are full of the descendants of those who left Ireland to escape the fairy curse, whose glowing hearts that gave them grace to see have now been replaced by TV. Folk art is the soil where all great art is rooted, said young Willie Yeats in 1901, refusing what is passing, clever, trivial, vulgar, insincere. And a sincere young painter and poet I once knew traveled throughout Canada for several years, collecting information on people and their art. And perhaps he spoke too much of what he had found, for his discoveries were stolen and put on TV, where they were mocked, insulted, and blasphemed by those who didn't know they are blind. I don't mind when the blind make war on the blind, for still the work goes on, the work of simple people learning how to sing with the help of the fairies, said young Willie Yeats in 1901. We want to know if people still believe in fairies, said the city editor to me, a naive cub reporter. And so I had to go into the street and stop people and ask them if they've never seen a fairy. After a couple of days of this, I discovered that fairy means something else in modern language. Of 438 people stopped in the street, 422 refused to discuss the question. Of the 16 who talked, 9 admitted having seen flying saucers periodically. 4 admitted having experienced astral projection, but none would admit having seen a fairy. At a garden party in London, England in 1801, the poet Blake was sitting beside an elegant lady. "Have you ever seen a fairy funeral?" he asked. "I have, and they used a little leaf for the bier," he said. The woman quickly changed her seat. It is well known that only fools such as Blake, simple people with untroubled minds, can ever hope to see a fairy, although the fairies reputedly inhabit every land from the equator to the poles and are more numerous than the rabbits. Once and only once did I see fairies. I had fallen asleep in the garden and half awoke to find the lawn the scene of a huge battle between the armies of red fairies and the blue. So there are fairies after all, I said to myself as I looked harder and the battle faded. Basically an educated man and no fool, although my mind is often ridiculously undisturbed even in these horrible times. I realize the fairies do not really exist except as projections of the simple mind. But I think the red fairies won that war, for 2 little girls I know have each reported seeing female fairies in red gowns, one flying through the air, the other sitting under a tree. Another girl I know, aged 25 and married to a millionaire, says she often sees fairies when she walks in the woods, fairies of all colors except blue. And a woman I know in her 30s, married to a postman, used to see black fairies frequently. She considered them angels of death, and they would be calling to her to her doom, and they would appear in the distance wearing black capes and hoods, waiting patiently for her, and she, by an act of will, hardened her heart and forced them to disappear forever. Perhaps they wanted her for her purity. When her heart turned hard, they abandoned her. And so she lost her life, although she saved it. I am now forced to admit I lied a while back. From certain angles I see angels. I have seen fairies also, often in dream and vision, and have often seen the hand of fairies snapping branches off trees I was about to prune, hiding things and making them reappear in strange places. and I've heard them call my name, and I've heard their lovely music. And I believe my belief is shared by many, who, because of natural fear, will not admit it. And so, my fellow Canadians, or anyone who hears these words, if you believe as I believe, and have seen strange things you've feared to speak of, please write me, care of my publisher. David McFadden. Selected poems: My Body Was Eaten by Dogs, edited by George Bowring in 1981. And lots of good poems in here, of course, divided into the 60s and the 70s. Obviously an early selected, there's been more since then. But that's the only one that the poem Fairies is in. And I wanted to mention it because I was working in the garden the other day, as I'm doing a lot, it's June, lots of pruning. I felt the spirit of David McFadden talking to me, rather like, a little trickster fairy. And he came several times, and he passed into eternity a couple of weeks ago, I believe, and is experiencing his funeral today, I believe, also. Not that that matters when anyone looks at this video 3 years from now, but it seemed appropriate. And I always liked that poem. And I think it got passed over because of the subject matter. And David was a good friend of mine, and as well as being a much admired poet on my part and on the part of many others, and he will be much loved and missed over the years to come. And we take this opportunity to bid him a fond adieu. Au revoir, mesdames et messieurs. I throw in a little French because we're in Canada. Lousy Scottish French, of course. He did tell me once he was rather fond of Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. I think we were driving along Lakeshore Road, coming onto the Gardiner at the time. We were rabbiting on like poets do about favourite things that we love. And I think he even talked about his favourite translation, which I now forget. And I bitched about some of the translations not being as good as I thought they ought to be. And, that usual poet stuff. And, it's a time like this when you remember old conversations. And I'm good at remembering old conversations. Actually, no, not that good at all. Pretty lousy. Anyway, let's move on to The Art of Darkness, a rather good book from the mid-80s, I think, 1984. And here's a poem called Frank O'Hara. It was the high school orchestra. We raised money by selling aluminum clothes peg boxes. On the side of each was a red emblem. I think it said realistic. You can check it out. There are still some nailed to posts in the east end of Hamilton, Ontario. And with the money we went on an Easter field trip to New York. The music teacher Bernard Blades fell in love with the string bass player Louis Lawrence, and she must have been all of 16. He left his wife and kids and married her. Actually, he stole it away from the trombone player who was also 16. This kind of thing never happens in Archie. The trombone player I met years later, and he told me that Mr. Blades and Lois had been very happy for a while and had a couple of kids of their own, but in her early 30s, Lois got cancer and died. And 2 weeks later, Mr. Blades had a heart attack and died. I thought the trombone player sounded a little smug, as if he were happy the way it turned out. He belonged to one of those funny religions, Seventh-day Adventists. Meanwhile, back in New York, I didn't want to go to the United Nations building, so I sneaked off to the Museum of Modern Art, which wasn't on our itinerary, and got into a long, interesting conversation with the man at the information counter. He was so nice to me and took me for a Coke and paid for it himself. And he knew all about poetry and art, and he even said Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs were friends of his. And he told me it was very important never to let yourself get bored by poetry if you wanted to keep writing, and he advised me to stay in Canada and give up my desire to move to New York when I turned 18. Years later, I read the poetry of Frank O'Hara, and when I saw his picture, I knew that's who it had been. And now Frank too, along with Mr. Blades and Lois, is dead. And I bet Frank at any rate is not bored, not even by this poem. Are you, Frank? Are you, David? Well, well, well. Isn't that appropriate? I just found that one, just kind of glancing through all my 20, well, maybe 13 or 17 David McFadden books. That was something fell over there. Sorry about that. And here's another one. On the Road Again, one of my favorites. All about touring around and reading. 1978, this one is. David wrote for a long time. Started in the early 60s. Had a little Gestetner magazine called Mountain or Under the Mountain or something like that, which of course you can't find anywhere now, but a bit of history there. How I Came to Understand Irving Layton, another Canadian poet of the 70s, 80s, and 60s, 70s, and 80s, I'd say. On a plane flying into Calgary, I found myself sitting next to a blonde, blue-eyed, 6-foot-tall, 70-year-old Mennonite lady of stern visage, who tried to bring her simplistic, fanatic notions about Christianity into every attempt at ordinary, friendly conversation. I'm going to have to start sitting in the smoking section, I thought. She'd spent all her life caring for her infirm mother, now 90, and was returning from the funeral in Owen Sound of her uncle, who was struck down in action, died while broadcasting a hellfire sermon all over the Bruce Peninsula, and now presumably was hectoring all the angels in heaven. She wanted to know what I did for a living, and when I said I was a writer, she wanted to know what I wrote about. And she got a little bit flustered when I told her I like to write about ordinary, everyday things, like descriptions of the people I meet on planes. She wanted to know if I believed in the life hereafter, and I said, you bet. And she said, that's what makes life worthwhile, isn't it? And I said, oh, I can think of other things that make life worthwhile. And she looked at me as if she wasn't quite sure what I meant, but wanted me to know if I meant what she thought I meant. She never did those things. So I figured I ought to turn the occasion into a self-educational opportunity, and I asked her to fill me in on the history of Mennonites. And she got embarrassed, and she said she didn't know much about history, being more interested in praying and serving Jesus Christ in her daily life, or something. But she did say they were all from Germany, and she did say there were all quite a few Mennonites still living in Germany. And so I asked her if the Mennonites were persecuted in the war, if the ones who were in Germany when Hitler came to power tried to stop him and were sent to the ovens and all that, or did they just stay silent? And she said she didn't know. No one had given her any data on that, although I later found out thousands were martyred in Europe in the 16th century, and 80% of all the conscientious objectors in Canada in World War II were Mennonites. But she said she'd rather just talk about Jesus Christ. All this talk about different religious denominations was a bit overdone, didn't I think? Who cares, she said as a dark cloud passed over her face. Who cares as long as you're Christian? Although I almost always abstained from meddling in the beliefs of others, something in her voice just hit me, and I began yelling so loud I almost woke the pilot. What? I cried. I couldn't stop myself. What about Jews? What about Arabs? What about Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, and Rastafarians? I looked at her. She looked a little uncomfortable. Her eyes looked frightened, as if the ship she'd been sailing all her life had suddenly been torpedoed and was sinking fast. And abruptly a look of relief, of pleasure, came into her softening blue eyes, as if for the first time in her life she realized that all the crap she'd been taught about non-Christians being heathens, less than human, doomed to eternal damnation, was wrong, and all the tiny muscles in her face began to relax. And I looked into her eyes again, and I could see them sliding into a third phase, the phase in which she suddenly realized not only Christ was God, but all of us are God, even Jews, and I thought I detected a halo-like glow forming around her head. And she loosened up and began enjoying the beautiful moment all around her, for the first time in years, and the heavens parted, and a beautiful dove flew down and landed on her head, and she moved over closer to me, and I could feel the long-neglected warmth of love radiating from her breast. And I even felt great all over. And I began thinking about Irving Layton, devoting his poetic life to destroying all this puerile Sunday school, steel-trap Christianity. And suddenly, for the first time, I understood my brother Irving. And I suddenly saw how enjoyable it must be for the old guy, and how easy it would be to get hooked on it, and hooked bad. Powerful stuff there, David. We all remember Irving and his ranting and raving. Well, maybe not all. I do. You have to be about our age to remember it. Whew. Keeping Evil at Bay from the same book. Bruce sits on my lap, chewing a button on my coat as I drive along dark, rainy city streets, my right hand running through his fur. The kids in the back sitting, eating ice cream cones, Joan watching for used car lots, dreaming of a car of her own. She finally gets me to stop at a small lot on King Street across from the Grace Anglican Church, where she had a brownie pack 12 years ago. It's the same lot where one horrendous night I spent 2 awful hours sitting in another car reading a certain novel of supernatural terror all the way through, wind howling, windshield wipers flapping back and forth, and the awful blood-curdling stream of sirens from ambulances, fire trucks, and police cruisers. And for quite a while after every time I passed this spot, my hair stood on end. What has attracted her attention is an 8-year-old Volkswagen, blue, with $550 soaped on the windshield. She wants me to check it out. She's a little worried that International Women's Year is almost over and she still hasn't got a car of her own. You check it out, I tell her, but she insists. You're the man, she tells me. So I sigh and get out and walk over to the car and put my foot down on the running board, and it snaps off. I press the toe of my shoe against the rusted out painted over door and it goes right through. The proprietor comes over and I say, "You forgot the decimal point. I'll give you $5.50 for it if it runs." "Of course it runs. It's certified," he says. I turn and walk away, half expecting him to call me back, but he doesn't, which kind of hurts, not because I wanted the car, but because I wanted to know if our roles were reversed, I wouldn't have the nerve to let him go, and I'd be on my knees begging him to make an offer. But then I remember the cars are just a front, and this place is really a mafia bookie joint. That's Hamilton for you. And we drive away. As we drive away, my daughters, bloated, give me their half-eaten ice cream cones. "Don't you like orange pineapple?" I asked. "Yes," they say, "but we're not hungry." And then a strange thing happened. I felt something stir in my head, a dim outline of a monstrous dream I'd perhaps suffered the night before, and, with elaborate, though unconscious care, forgotten. It reminded me of the first sudden crack in a large, weirdly shaped egg. I did not know what was going to happen next. For Barbara. "Barbara, put your flute down and pay attention. A motorcyclist in the high Andes has been forced off the road and is falling. Quick, do something." David. Great fun. Always a great fun poet. I could go on and on. Endless good poems from David McFadden. And we've read them before in this show, and we'll probably read them again. But there's a small selection of joyous, inquiring stuff that reeks of his spirit and his spirit of fun and inquiry and shit disturbing. And like I say, he's around. He's coming by and visiting people. If you feel a telepathic contact, don't doubt it. He's telling me he's been nattering to people and they're not always listening. That's because they can't hear. I'm one of these people that seem to be able to hear, bit of a psychic medium. Anyway, speaking of spirits and strange things that happen, a couple of poems on anesthesia. One of mine and one by my friend Laurence Hutchman. This is recalling surgery I had a few months ago. There. Just who was that figure? hooded and dark, leaning over my hospital bed, that night after surgery left me to the mercies of morphine. Just another ghost gadding about, more curious about others than their own motivations? Me, I was more moved by the sense of bilocation, tending to my houseplants miles away, a mother reassuring in the midst of the mysteries that make up our lives, whether here or there. Now, Lawrence's poem from his book Personal Encounters, from which we've read many times before, or several times anyway, and one called Poet Flying Over a Village. Awake from anesthesia, breaking the clouds, I see the blue-gold form of the poet, half farmer, half angel. He glides toward me through this waking pain in his lightfulness. I look down in the church steeple on the dark houses, the cows, the fields. Suddenly the doctor appears before me, her golden hair shining in the sun. I'm the essence of light, and I feel the rolling of hills. The village reminds me of Emery, childhood place of Elizabeth Arden. I'm traveling down this region in a morphine daze. I love to see, but can hardly keep my eyes open as my pen glides across the page to remind me of Chagall, the poet flying over the fields when he dreamed of his lost Belarus. I'm the essence of light. Oh yes, indeed we are. And mention of Village of Emery, I had Lawrence's new book is about his memories of Emery, and we'll get to that next time. Alden Nowlan, Canadian poet, long past. Brian Bartlett has ably and beautifully produced, edited a collected poems. Marvelous piece of work here, Brian, and a fine introductory essay, of course, as is appropriate for Alden, who died quite young some years ago, and managed to publish a good 10 or 12 books in his day, and was quite prominent in Canada. Anyway, I'm not sure if he's prominent anywhere else, but that's me being ignorant, me not knowing stuff that I ought to know. So here's a poem called On Hearing of the Death of Dr. William Carlos Williams. I am glad I did not read of his death until after a friend telephoned from another country and told me drunkenly, "The old man is dead," and I wanted to talk to someone who would understand. I am glad, too, I was drunk enough that the two of us could sit side by side on the crossbar of a telephone pole midway between Orono, Maine and Hartland, New Brunswick, dangle our feet in the sky and drink to the memory of an old man who took too long to die because he had never learned how the trick was done. That was from a book called Bread, Wine and Salt. Here's another short one called The Hollow Man from the same book. They tell me they have never aspired to be poets. Their jobs, when they were young, were more demanding than mine. With their sweetest smiles, nothing great was ever accomplished by writing before breakfast. To create, a man must be free. Some day, perhaps, they'll live in Mexico or Italy. Meanwhile, they endure as they must. Then hand me the poem they've preserved since their last year in university. The Hollow Man. The Mysterious Naked Man. A mysterious naked man has been reported on Cranston Avenue. The police are performing the usual ceremonies with colored lights and sirens. Almost everyone is outdoors and strangers are conversing excitedly as they do during disasters when their involvement is peripheral. What did he look like? The lieutenant is asking. I don't know, said the witness. He was naked. There is talk of dogs. This is no ordinary case of indecent exposure. The man has been seen a dozen times since the milkman spotted him, and now the sky is turning purple and voices carry a long way, and the children have gone a little crazy, as they often do at dusk, and the cars are arriving from other sections of the city. And the mysterious naked man is kneeling behind a garbage can or lying on his belly in someone's garden, or maybe even hiding in the branches of a tree where the wind from the harbour whips at his naked body. And by now he's probably done whatever it was he wanted to do, and wishes he could go to sleep, or die, or take to the air like Superman. For Claudine, because I love her, from the same book. Love is also my finding this house emptier than a stranger ever could. Is it the sound of your movements enlivening the chairs, although I hear nothing? Is it the weight of your small body moving the house, so little no machine could ever assess it, though my mind knows? Is it some old, holy animal instinct that fills every room with you gently, so I'm aware of it only when I come home, and there is nothing here? Circles. You keep peeling off hollow dolls and finding another inside. I divide into men, fat and thin, half a dozen boys, children, and babies of various sizes. I could have said it a year ago in a Russian boutique, but it didn't happen until tonight, and then there was no apparent connection at all, so that I was startled when I felt myself lifted off the chair, and stretched, and shaken. An exchange of gifts. As long as you read this poem, I will be writing it. I am writing it here and now before your eyes, although you can't see me. Perhaps you'll dismiss this as a verbal trick. The joke is you're wrong. The real trick is you're pretending this is something fixed and solid, external to us both. I tell you better. I will keep on writing this poem for you, even after I'm dead. That's a couple of dead poets tonight, but you know, that's English literature. It's jam-packed with dead poets, much more than living ones. Now, last time we read from Kevin Connolly's Ziphoid Process, his newish book, 2017. Well, I'd say that was new. And we read a terribly funny satirical poem. And I said, okay, let's get to one of the serious ones next time. So here we go. I don't even know if this is serious, but it's certainly not satirical. Revolver. We're used to a season progressing logically, winter to spring. Pick up the pace, babe. We're not paying you to look pretty. There really are people who think about this all the time. It's all sounding very much like me all of a sudden. The one tired gesture, awning troubled by rain, future arced overhead like a flashlight on a child's bedsheet. Let us be thankful for the fools, naked people and so on, given space. Even shadows rejoice, conjoin, conjure. In a way too complicated to acknowledge, all footage mimes the flight patterns of bees. Grammar is green, lovely is red. The girl who attended Carver lives next door. Melodrama, diphthong, dandruff, rhizome, interpretation. That's where the problems start. Can you think of a more apt metaphor for our distress? An understanding that we must never tell the truth. Shadow on the bed humming, as if this sense of being grounded, this sudden quiet, and yes, Yes, of course it was. Let's decide now it's all a euphemism, from those who ducked to those who ran a quiet camera over it. The son was good-natured most of the time. Pictures in which she looks happy, though the journalist is sad. What lives over bone is fragile, doomed really. Tiny acrobat walking a rope of milk. Having served up so many slices of yourself over the years, the little hands shoved up under your jumper in deep grass, light panting under a yellow umbrella. Ditties for the dead, speaking parts, your figure less than Greek, a little weak. All night some nights. Most, I'd guess. Skipping classes, warnings, footprints on the bread, the sound of rain annihilating itself on the grass. These skies unchanging, irreversible, inexcusable, push you out onto the porch in hope or worry. How could something so rote find time to surprise? The art of sounding colours as they stray. Being what they are, photos capture the watcher's tones. Like goats or flowers, like reeds, even swimmers gawk at stones and rivers. But is it so wrong to want? So terrible to love the rain? Beautiful as it always is? New language to describe new situations, new mental constructs. Beautiful as it always is. That's poetry for you. That's life, that's death, that's eternity. Beautiful as it always is. The mysterious naked man, as Alden mentioned. Wanting to fly like Superman. And that's what we all do when we sleep. Fly like Superman and then forget. So, another poetry show comes and goes. Remembering fondly David W. McFadden. Great lyric, philosophic poet. Stamped in Canadian psyche. As Canadian as they come. And certainly a very amusing and entertaining travel writer. Do check out his travel books. Trip Around the Great Lakes, Innocent in Cuba, Innocent in Scotland, etc., etc. Very amusing and entertaining. Really just wonderful reads. And not as well known as they ought to be. And perhaps the years to come will gain them a greater audience. A more appreciative audience. I certainly enjoyed them. Anyway, au revoir, mon frère David. See you soon. See you all soon. Friends of poetry, lovers of language.